Helen Richard was 33 years old when her husband, Baxter Richard, slapped her across the face during his mother's charity gala. The ballroom was packed with 600 guests in expensive suits and shining dresses. The microphone caught the sound of the slap, and it echoed through every speaker in the room. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Baxter's mother, Laura Richard, slowly raised her champagne glass with a smile on her face. A few people laughed nervously because Laura laughed first. Helen stood there with blood on her lip, staring at all of them. Inside her mind, one thought repeated itself over and over. None of these people know who my mother really is. 48 hours later, Baxter Richard would stand in front of a judge. Laura Richard would lose control of the charity foundation she had ruled for over 20 years. And Helen would sit in her mother's small kitchen, eating homemade stuffed cabbage rolls while rain tapped softly against the windows. But the story did not begin at the gala. It started 3 years earlier, on the day Helen married into the Richard family. Back then, she believed kindness could earn acceptance. She believed patience could turn strangers into family. She believed if she stayed respectful long enough, Laura Richard would eventually welcome her with open arms instead of cold smiles. Welcome back to the channel where women do not yell, they act. If you have ever been told you are not good enough for someone's family, this one is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Helen grew up in a tiny apartment in Akron, Ohio. 1 bedroom. 1 bathroom. Thin walls and old windows that rattled during storms. Her mother, Linda Riot, raised her alone while working 3 different jobs. Linda had moved to Britain from America when she was 23 before later settling in Ohio. She arrived with only $400 and a small suitcase full of books. During the day, she worked as a court interpreter. At night, she studied law in public libraries until closing time. Helen remembered sitting beside her mother as a child, coloring quietly while Linda highlighted legal papers. "Truth matters," Linda always said softly. "But you must be strong enough to defend it." Linda passed the bar exam at 31 after failing the first time. From then on, she repeated one rule constantly inside their home. "No crying without a plan," she would tell Helen whenever life became difficult. "Tears are information. They tell you something is wrong. After that, you fix it." Helen never forgot those words. She studied hard, earned a full scholarship to Ohio State, and graduated with honors in health administration. Her first job was in hospital compliance, reviewing records and checking financial reports for problems. She became very good at noticing details other people ignored. Numbers told stories. Missing money left patterns. Lies always left traces behind if someone looked carefully enough. Helen believed the hardest years of her life were already behind her. She had her degree, her career, and a quiet apartment with only her name on the lease. Then she met Baxter Richard during a hospital fundraiser in Columbus. Baxter was charming in a calm, effortless way. He remembered small things Helen mentioned during conversations and brought them up weeks later. After 6 months of dating, he proposed to her on a quiet park bench with a diamond ring that cost more than Helen's car. Baxter smiled and said, "My mother will want to approve the ring first." Helen laughed because she thought it was a joke. But Baxter did not laugh at all. Laura Richard became involved in the wedding almost immediately after the engagement. Within 3 days, she had already chosen the venue, the flowers, and half the guest list. "This wedding represents the Richard family," she said firmly while flipping through seating charts. Helen tried to suggest adding her mother's stuffed cabbage rolls to the menu. Laura smiled tightly. That kind of food would confuse the caterers. Baxter stayed silent beside his mother. Helen swallowed her disappointment and nodded politely. She told herself compromise was part of marriage. Linda noticed the sadness in her daughter's eyes during dress fittings and late-night phone calls. One evening, she handed Helen a white silk handkerchief stitched carefully with pale blue thread. "For your wedding day," Linda whispered. "Wipe your tears, then make your plan." Baxter's father had died from a heart attack more than 20 years earlier, leaving behind a large trust fund and a successful building company. After his death, Laura controlled everything. She gave Baxter a monthly allowance on top of his salary from the family business. Baxter's younger sister, Claire, received the same treatment. Every important decision passed through Laura first. Vacations, home repairs, business investments, even donations had to be approved by her. "I'm protecting the family legacy," Laura often said proudly. But Helen quickly realized it was really about control. Everyone in the family adjusted their opinions whenever Laura entered the room. Even Baxter changed around her, becoming quieter, weaker, almost nervous. The first Thanksgiving after the wedding showed Helen exactly how little Laura respected her. Helen spent hours preparing her mother's stuffed cabbage rolls using Linda's old recipe. She carried the dish carefully into Laura's large dining room and placed it beside the turkey. Laura lifted the foil cover slowly and stared at the food in silence. Then she turned toward the table and calmly said, "She is not one of us." Claire laughed loudly. Baxter stared down at his plate without speaking. Laura looked at Claire and added, "Please bring the real food from the kitchen." Helen felt heat rise into her chest. Without saying a word, she picked up the dish, carried it outside, and sat inside her car alone for 10 silent minutes. That night, Helen could not sleep. Baxter acted as if nothing unusual had happened. "Mom was joking," he said while brushing his teeth. Helen stared at him in disbelief. "A joke is supposed to be funny," she answered quietly. Baxter sighed. "You take everything too personally." Helen said nothing after that. Instead, she opened her laptop and created a folder titled Insurance. She did not fully know why she made it. She only knew something inside her no longer trusted the Richard family. She started saving screenshots, messages, and small notes about strange conversations. Linda's words echoed in her head. "Tears are information." Helen had finally started understanding exactly what her mother meant. During their second year of marriage, Baxter wanted to buy a large house in Westlake. The price was far beyond what Helen felt comfortable spending. "We can afford something smaller ourselves," she suggested one evening. Baxter looked shocked. "Mom already agreed to help with the down payment." Helen frowned. "Why does your mother need to be involved in every decision?" Baxter became defensive immediately. "She's helping us. Why is that a problem?" By the next morning, Laura had already contacted a realtor and arranged the mortgage herself. Her name ended up on part of the paperwork. Helen quietly opened a separate savings account that same week. She increased her retirement contributions and began strengthening professional connections outside the Richard family circle. One night around 2 in the morning, Baxter woke from a nightmare about his father. His face looked pale in the darkness. "Dad would have liked you," he whispered while Helen held him close. "He wasn't like Mom. He listened to people." For a brief moment, Helen saw the version of Baxter that existed underneath years of Laura's influence. Vulnerable, honest, human. But by morning, everything changed again. Laura called during breakfast, and Baxter's entire attitude shifted after answering. He became cold and distant within minutes. Helen watched him laugh nervously at something his mother said on the phone. It felt like watching someone disappear behind a locked door she could never open. A few months later, Helen discovered a private family group chat called Real Richards. One evening, Baxter left his phone on the kitchen counter while taking a shower. Helen glanced at the screen after hearing several notifications. Curiosity pulled at her stomach. The passcode was Baxter's father's birthday. Inside the chat, Claire had posted a photo of Helen from a family brunch. "Discount store energy," Claire wrote beside laughing emojis. Laura replied with, "Some people cannot hide where they came from." Baxter had reacted with a laughing face. Helen scrolled through weeks of insults about her clothes, her background, and even Linda's accent. Her chest tightened painfully, but her hands stayed steady as she took screenshots of everything. Helen transferred every screenshot into the insurance folder before returning Baxter's phone exactly where she found it. Then she walked into the bathroom and stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. Her husband had laughed at her alongside his mother and sister for months. The betrayal hurt more than the insults themselves. Later that night, Baxter wrapped an arm around her while sleeping peacefully beside her in bed. Helen lay awake staring at the ceiling. She realized something important in that quiet darkness. Laura Richard did not hate her because of who she was. Laura hated her because Helen could see through the family's performance. And deep down, Laura knew it. Every spring, Laura hosted a huge Mother's Day charity gala at Briarwood Country Club. The event raised money for a children's hospital wing and attracted politicians, business owners, and hospital executives from across Ohio. Laura treated the gala like a royal ceremony. Her face appeared on banners throughout the ballroom. Claire managed the event planning while Baxter sat proudly beside his mother each year. Helen was assigned small volunteer tasks instead. "You're so good with people," Claire said sweetly while handing her name tags and seating charts. Helen smiled politely and accepted every task. The more access she gained, the more information she quietly collected. Years working in compliance had trained her eyes to notice details other people overlooked. 3 weeks before the gala, Helen entered Laura's home office to collect printed programs for the event. While gathering the boxes, she noticed financial records lying open across the desk. Donation totals listed over $300,000 collected for the charity. Later that evening, Helen walked through the country club lobby and glanced at the glowing electronic donation board near the entrance. The public display showed only $280,000 raised. Helen stopped walking immediately. A $60,000 difference. In her line of work, missing money always meant trouble. She did not touch the records or take photographs that day. She simply memorized the numbers carefully and drove home in complete silence, already feeling a plan beginning to form. That weekend, Helen drove 2 hours to Akron to visit her mother. Linda opened the door before Helen even knocked twice. "You look tired," she said softly. They sat together at the kitchen table while coffee brewed nearby. Helen explained everything slowly. Thanksgiving, the group chat, Laura's insults, the missing charity money. Linda listened without interrupting once. When Helen finally finished, Linda folded her hands calmly. "Do you have proof?" Helen nodded. "Screenshots, records, dates, everything saved." Linda leaned back in her chair and studied her daughter carefully. "What do you want now?" Helen stared down at her coffee mug before answering quietly. "I want to leave, but I want to leave standing up." Linda nodded slowly. "Then wait." Helen frowned. "Wait for what?" Linda's eyes hardened slightly. "For them to expose themselves publicly. Cruel people are careless when they feel untouchable." Helen drove home thinking about those words the entire way. The gala was only 2 weeks away. Laura was already preparing speeches and decorations like she was planning a royal celebration. Claire called Helen constantly with small assignments. "You'll handle guest greetings at the entrance," Claire explained cheerfully. "It's perfect for you." Helen understood the real reason immediately. Laura wanted her visible enough to work but unimportant enough to disappear into the background. Helen accepted the assignment anyway. She had stopped expecting kindness from them long ago. A few days later, Helen asked Claire for access to the donor database. "I'd like to help organize thank you cards after the gala," she explained. Claire emailed the login details without hesitation. That night, while Baxter slept upstairs, Helen opened the database at the kitchen table. She reviewed years of donations and vendor payments carefully. Most of the records looked normal at first glance. Then she found 2 suspicious companies connected to gala expenses. One had no website, no active business registration, and only a post office box address. The second company listed an empty dry cleaning shop as its office location. Together, the fake companies had received almost $60,000 over 3 years. Helen recognized the pattern immediately. In compliance work, shell companies were common tools for hiding stolen money. Small payments spread over time avoided triggering audits. She spent hours compiling records, payment dates, addresses, and screenshots into a detailed report. Everything was organized carefully, just like her professional case files at work. When she finished, she copied the report onto an encrypted flash drive and mailed it to Linda's house. Then she saved another copy in the insurance folder. Helen leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Laura Richard had spent years humiliating people while believing nobody would ever question her. Now the numbers were finally beginning to speak for themselves. 1 week before the gala, Baxter came home late smelling strongly of whiskey. Helen sat quietly at the kitchen counter waiting for him. "Why am I seated at table 47? She asked calmly. Baxter loosened his tie with frustration already showing on his face. "Mom wants immediate family near the stage." Helen stared at him. "I'm your wife." Baxter rubbed his forehead impatiently. "Can you please not make this difficult?" Helen's voice stayed calm. "Your mother humiliates me in front of people constantly, and you never defend me." Baxter's jaw tightened. "Mom says you've been discussing family business at work." Helen blinked in disbelief. "That's not true." Baxter shrugged weakly. "She wouldn't say it without a reason." That sentence changed something inside Helen permanently. Baxter trusted his mother's lies more than his own wife's honesty. She slept in the guest room that night. Around midnight, she heard Claire speaking on the phone with Laura in the pantry downstairs. The door was slightly open. "The Mother's Day speech is ready," Claire whispered excitedly. Laura laughed softly. "Good. If Helen reacts emotionally, everyone will finally see she doesn't belong in this family." Claire giggled. "Baxter always gets emotional about his father on Mother's Day. He'll side with you immediately." Helen stood silently in the hallway listening. The humiliation plan for the gala was intentional. Every insult had been carefully prepared in advance. The night before the gala, Laura hosted a family dinner at her mansion. Helen sat quietly while Claire talked endlessly about flower arrangements and decorations. Then Claire casually mentioned Linda. "Does your mother still live in that little apartment in Akron?" she asked sweetly. Laura sighed dramatically. "Some people are comfortable living small lives." Claire smirked at Helen across the table. "She's still not one of us." The exact same words Laura used during Thanksgiving. Baxter cut his steak without looking up. Helen excused herself calmly and walked to the bathroom. Inside, she removed Linda's silk handkerchief from her purse and held it tightly. A text message appeared moments later after Helen messaged her mother. "Tomorrow I'll be ready." Linda replied almost instantly. "Good." Later that night, Helen searched the home office for her phone charger. While reaching behind Baxter's desk, she noticed an old yellow envelope inside a drawer. Written across the front were the words, "For Baxter. Open when you marry." It was signed by Baxter's late father. Helen hesitated before opening it. Inside was a 2-page handwritten letter. Baxter's father described Laura as strong but deeply controlling. Then Helen reached a sentence that made her chest tighten. "If your wife ever tells you she is hurting, believe her. I failed to protect your mother from pain because I stayed silent too long." Helen photographed both pages carefully before returning the letter exactly where she found it. The gala night arrived with crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, and hundreds of wealthy guests filling the ballroom. Laura wore an emerald gown covered in diamonds. Claire rushed around giving orders like a nervous queen preparing for a coronation. Helen arrived in a simple navy dress and comfortable flats because she would spend hours standing near the entrance greeting guests. Claire handed her a cheap paper name tag that only read Helen. "No last name." "We ran out of formal tags," Claire said with fake sympathy. Helen clipped it onto her dress without reacting. For 90 minutes, she welcomed every guest with calm professionalism while Baxter drank champagne at table 1 beside his mother. During a quiet moment, Helen walked past the glowing donation board in the lobby. The total still displayed $280,000. She took a quick photograph with her phone and sent it silently to Linda. Then she returned to greeting guests. Around 7:30, dinner finally began. Helen sat alone at table 47 near the back wall beside strangers who treated her far more kindly than the Richard family ever had. An older retired teacher named Mrs. Brooks smiled warmly at her. "You must be Baxter's wife," she said kindly. "He's lucky to have you." Helen thanked her softly. Nobody at the table mentioned that Helen was sitting hundreds of feet away from her husband. At 8:15, Laura stepped onto the stage holding a champagne glass and microphone. The room fell silent immediately. "Tonight is about mothers," Laura announced proudly. "Women who sacrifice everything for family." Applause filled the ballroom. Then Laura's tone changed slowly. Unfortunately, not everyone understands family values. Nervous laughter spread across several tables. Laura looked directly at Helen across the ballroom. Some women marry into good families but bring foreign customs and strange traditions, expecting everyone else to adapt. Helen felt the room shift uncomfortably around her. Mrs. Brooks placed a gentle hand on Helen's arm. "Are you all right, dear?" Helen nodded once without speaking. Her fingers tightened quietly around Linda's silk handkerchief inside her pocket. Laura continued smiling as she raised her glass higher. A real mother raises children with proper values, not in tiny apartments while working as... She paused dramatically. What was it again? A translator. Several guests gasped quietly. Laura was mocking Linda publicly on Mother's Day. Helen stood slowly from table 47 and walked toward the stage while 600 people watched in silence. She stopped below the podium and looked up calmly. "My mother worked 3 jobs and studied law at night," Helen said clearly. "She didn't need money or social status to prove she was a good mother. She proved it every day of my life." Her voice never shook once. Laura pressed a hand dramatically against her chest. Tears filled her eyes instantly. "Do you see how she attacks me?" she cried loudly into the microphone. Baxter stood up from table 1, already drunk from several glasses of champagne. "Apologize to my mother," he snapped while moving quickly toward Helen. She stared directly at him. "No!" Baxter's hand struck her face so hard the microphone amplified the sound through every speaker in the ballroom. Silence crashed over the room immediately afterward. Helen tasted blood inside her mouth. Laura smiled faintly while Claire covered her mouth, barely hiding laughter. Only Mrs. Brooks stood from her seat in shock. "Oh my God!" the older woman whispered loudly. Helen removed Linda's white silk handkerchief and pressed it carefully against her bleeding lip. Then she folded it calmly and returned it to her pocket. 3 guests already had phones raised recording the aftermath. Nobody moved toward Baxter except Mrs. Brooks. Helen looked slowly across the ballroom at all 600 faces staring back at her. "Drama queen," Claire called from near the bar. "She can't even take a joke." Helen turned without responding and walked toward the exit with her back perfectly straight. Behind her, Baxter shouted, "Helen, come back!" Laura's voice followed through the microphone. "Let her go. She'll crawl back eventually." Helen pushed through the ballroom doors into the cold May night outside. The parking lot was dark except for scattered streetlights and blinking lights from catering vans nearby. Helen stood beside her car for several silent seconds before pulling out her phone. Blood still stained her chin. Her cheek was already swelling. She scrolled to Linda's contact and pressed call. "Helen." Linda answered immediately. Helen's voice cracked for the first time that night. "Mom, please come." Linda became silent for 3 seconds. "Did he hurt you?" Helen swallowed hard. "He hit me. In front of everyone." Linda's voice turned calm and flat. "Listen carefully. Do not wash your face. Do not change your clothes. Sit inside your car and lock the doors. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Helen sat inside her silver Honda with the doors locked while the parking lot stayed quiet around her. She stared at the dashboard clock, counting every minute. Inside the ballroom, the party continued as if nothing serious had happened. Linda's instructions echoed in her head. "Do not wash your face. That is evidence." Helen remembered hearing those same words years earlier when her college roommate had been shoved into a wall by her boyfriend. Back then, Linda helped the girl file a police report. Helen never imagined she would someday need the same advice herself. At exactly 9:58 p.m., a dark blue sedan pulled into the parking lot. Linda stepped out wearing a black coat over her house dress and walked straight toward Helen's car. Linda opened the passenger door and crouched beside her daughter silently. She examined the bruise forming beneath Helen's eye and the dried blood on her chin. Then she gently held Helen's face between both hands. "All right," Linda said calmly. "Here's what we do next." Her voice sounded steady and professional, like someone preparing for court. "First, I photograph your injuries. Second, we go back inside and identify witnesses. Third, we file a police report tonight." Helen looked terrified. I don't want to go back in there. Linda squeezed her hand firmly. You won't be alone this time. Together, they walked toward the ballroom entrance side by side while guests inside slowly noticed their return. The music stopped when Laura saw Helen re-enter the ballroom with Linda beside her. Conversations faded table by table until the entire room became silent again. Laura crossed the floor quickly, her expression full of irritation. If you came back to apologize, she snapped, you can do it privately. Linda faced her calmly. My name is Linda Riot, she said clearly. I'm here because your son assaulted my daughter in front of 600 witnesses. The ballroom became completely still. Laura forced a laugh. That's a family matter. Linda shook her head slowly. Battery is not a family matter. It's a criminal matter. Several guests exchanged nervous glances while Claire stood frozen beside the stage holding her clipboard tightly. Baxter stepped forward looking pale and drunk. Helen, let's just go home and talk privately, he begged weakly. She won't be going home with you tonight, Linda answered immediately. Laura suddenly burst into dramatic tears again. Your father would be ashamed of this, she cried toward Baxter. Helen finally spoke again. Actually, his letter says something very different. Laura's entire face drained white. What letter? Helen held her gaze calmly. The letter he wrote before he died. The one where he admitted his biggest mistake was staying silent while you hurt people. 600 people heard every word. Laura opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out immediately. For the first time all evening, she looked afraid. Claire rushed toward her mother, desperately trying to regain control. This is ridiculous, she snapped loudly. Baxter barely touched her. Linda turned toward Claire calmly. So you witnessed the assault? Claire answered too quickly. Yes, but... She stopped suddenly after realizing what she had admitted publicly. Helen spoke before anyone else could. There's something else everyone here should know. The ballroom stayed silent as she continued. The gala records show $340,000 donated this year. But the public donation board outside only displays $280,000. Guests immediately began whispering. Laura stared at Helen in disbelief. You went through my records? Helen nodded slowly. I reviewed them carefully. 2 vendor companies connected to this gala don't legally exist. Laura completely lost control after that. You ungrateful little snake, she screamed while pointing at Helen and Linda. Your daughter destroyed this family. Linda never raised her voice once. Your son hit my daughter in public, she answered calmly. That is what destroyed this family. A man near the front table suddenly stood up and identified himself as an off-duty police sergeant. Would you like me to call this in? He asked Helen directly. Helen looked at Linda before answering quietly. Yes. The microphone on the stage was still live, broadcasting every word through the ballroom speakers. Laura's angry shouting echoed loudly across the room while guests stared at her with growing discomfort and disbelief. Officer Daniel Morris arrived less than 15 minutes later. Mrs. Brooks immediately approached him and offered a witness statement. Several guests also admitted they had recorded the slap on their phones. Officer Morris photographed Helen's injuries carefully before turning toward Baxter. Did you strike your wife tonight, sir? Baxter looked helplessly at his mother. Laura's eyes silently begged him to deny everything. But the room was full of witnesses and recordings. Baxter lowered his head. Yes. Officer Morris nodded professionally. You are under arrest for domestic battery. The handcuffs clicked around Baxter's wrists while 600 silent guests watched. Helen stood beside Linda feeling strangely calm. The sound of those handcuffs felt louder than the slap itself. As officers escorted Baxter toward the ballroom exit, Helen watched Laura carefully for the first time that night. Beneath the anger and manipulation, she finally saw fear. Real fear. Laura pointed shakily toward Helen. You planned this, she shouted. You came here to destroy us. Linda stepped closer to her. No, she said quietly. Your son made his own choices tonight. Laura reached for the stage microphone instinctively, desperate to regain control of the room. But her shaking hand knocked it sideways, sending loud screeching feedback across the ballroom. Nobody rushed to help her. Nobody applauded anymore. Helen and Linda walked out together beneath the glowing donation board still displaying the false number in bright blue lights. The weeks afterward changed everything. Baxter accepted a plea deal that included anger management classes, community service, and a restraining order. Helen filed for divorce within 72 hours. Because she had documented everything for years, the process moved quickly. She kept her own savings, retirement accounts, and career. She asked for none of the Richard family money. Meanwhile, Helen submitted the charity financial report to the state attorney general's office. An investigation soon confirmed major accounting irregularities within Laura's foundation. The gala was suspended indefinitely while auditors reviewed years of records. Laura stepped down publicly as chairwoman, and Claire lost her event planning position. For the first time in decades, Laura Richard could no longer control the room she stood inside. 3 months later, Helen moved into a small apartment near Akron. It reminded her of the place where she grew up, except this time everything inside belonged to her alone. She accepted a new position as compliance director for a healthcare nonprofit and finally built a life without the Richard family attached to it. Every Sunday, she visited Linda for dinner. They ate stuffed cabbage rolls together at the same kitchen table where Helen once cried over coffee years earlier. One evening, Linda asked softly, "How do you feel now?" Helen smiled for the first time in months. "Like I can finally breathe." Later that week, Mrs. Brooks mailed Helen a handwritten card. It simply read, "Some lessons require courage to teach. Proud of you, dear." Helen pinned it to her refrigerator and left it there forever. If this story reminded you that you deserve better from a partner, from a family, from yourself, take that as your sign. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next.